Prynhawn da, croeso nôl, welcome back. Prynhawn da, gobeithio bod chi wedi mwynhau eich cynnog gymaint â nes I. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and had an opportunity to go outside. The sun hid from us for a bit, it was a little bit windy out there, but I hope you had a nice lunch. You will have to press the button on your translation headset to get it to work again. So you'll need to reignite it, give it a bit of a boost after lunch. Ddysg chi wasgu'r botymau nawr. Iawn, ni adlu chi ddod mewn a setlo. Diolch yn fawr.
Prynhawn da. Ar ôl dweud y drefn a dweud wrthych chi ddod nôl ar amser, dyna lle o'n i'n chatan yn y cefn. Ond mae yn braf siarad gyda phawb yn diwe. Ac fel wedys I ar y dechrau, mae yn rhan o bwrpas y dydd. Felly gobeithio bod chi wedi mwynhau eich cinio. Ni'n barod nawr am sesiynau'r prynhawn, a dwi yn sicr yn edrych ymlaen at groesawu'r siaradwyr sydd gyda ni y prynhawn yma, ac unwaith eto prynhawn yma, ni yn gobeithio bydd cyfle I chi hefyd ofyn cwestiynau yn dilyn cyfraniadau yn siaradwyr ni. Nawr, mae'r rhaglen yn dweud mae'r athro Rob Dunbar sy'n siarad nesaf. Nid yr athro Rob Dunbar sydd yn eistedd gyda fi fan hyn yn y blaen. Yn anffodus, mae Rob wedi profi profedigaeth deuluol a dwi ddim wedi gallu teithio I Gymru I fod gyda ni. Mae yn gyfaill I Gymru a'r Gymraeg a roedd yn awyddus iawn I fod yma, ond dyw amgylchiadau ddim wedi caniatáu hynny. Felly dwi yn dwbl diolchgar I Seamus o Concannon, Comisiynydd Iaith Newydd Iwerddon, am gamu'r adwy ar y funud ola. Mae Seamus yn gomisiynydd iaith mwy newydd na fi hyd yn oed, ac mae heddi'n rhoi cyfle iddo fe siarad gyda ni am y datblygiadau sydd yn digwydd yn Iwerddon o ganlyniad i'r ddeddfwriaeth iaith newydd gawson nhw yn 2021 sydd wedi cyfleidio'r drefn safonau sydd gyda ni yng Nghymru. Seamus, I was giving you a very warm welcome and thanking you for stepping in at the last moment and explaining that you are newer than me. So we wish you well with your work and also look forward to hearing your presentation this afternoon. Seamus, diolch.
Diolch I bechordydd an áthas arm a bhain seo líb ag cógáil an IALC a Gardaíf. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Eva. My name is Seamus O'Concannon, and Commissioner Tango, the Language Commissioner appointed under the Official Languages Act in Ireland. On behalf of everyone in Effic and Commissioner Tang in Ireland, I would wish to offer my sincerest condolences to the Dunbar family on their recent loss. I am joined here today by my colleagues Orly de Burca, Complaints Officer, and Maggie Nichain, Operations Officer from our office in Ireland. And they are more than willing to bat any difficult questions at the end. They're great colleagues, I have to say. I have been serving as Commissioner Tanga since last December, and some of you, I'm sure, were acquainted with my predecessor, Ronan O'Donnell, who was appointed as the Media Development Commissioner with Comisiún na Meán in Ireland last year. That's the new regulatory body, Media Commission, set up in Ireland. I am the third person to hold this position, succeeding Ronan and his predecessor, Sean O'Curran, the first Commissioner Tang in Ireland, who played a crucial role in founding the IALC, as highlighted by Colin Williams in his press release, and it's great to see Colin again. The importance of the IALC cannot be overstated in sharing expertise and best practices to safeguard language rights and promote an understanding of multilingual and human rights policies in each of our jurisdictions. All of us in Efik Commissioner Tango look forward to playing our role in the future prosperity of the IALC. I welcome the opportunity today to talk about some important issues we are experiencing in Ireland with respect to implementing Irish language rights. The first Official Languages Act of 2003, which created the role of Commissioner Tango in Ireland, placed the provision of public services through Irish on a statutory footing. It is most welcome that the Official Languages Amendment Act 2021, which strengthened the original 2003 Act, is coming into force on a phased basis at the moment. In this context, my talk will include the evolving landscape for strengthening language rights in Ireland and some key challenges we have identified through our office's work in recent years. As you can glean from the title of this presentation, we believe that upholding core values that underpin trust in public services are essential in delivering on language rights. The values and drivers of trust in public services, equality, integrity, reliability, openness and responsiveness are crucial to strengthen language rights by delivering better public services for the language community. I will reflect on how these values are very much emphasised in current Irish government strategy relating to providing better public services in Ireland and the importance of embedding these values, these core values, in upholding Irish language rights. The role of Commissioner Tango and Efik Commissioner Tango was established under the Official Languages Act 2003. The overarching aim of this act is to increase and improve the standard of Irish language public services. The Commissioner's independent statutory role is to monitor compliance by public bodies with the provisions of the Act and investigate complaints from the public about alleged breaches of the legislation. Offering advice to the public regarding their language rights and to public bodies regarding their obligations under the Act is also a key function. The Office therefore operates as an Ombudsman service and as a compliance agency. Parallels can be drawn between the Official Languages Act 2003 and the passage of the Welsh Language Act 1993 through the UK Parliament, which, as we know, created the statutory Welsh Language Board and introduced the Welsh Language Scheme as a key instrument by which the principle of treating English and Welsh on a basis of equality would be realised in the public sector in Wales. However, there is a very important distinction between the roles of Efik Commissioner Tango and the Welsh Language Board at the time. In the Irish context, the responsibility for promoting the Irish language lies with the government department responsible for Gaeltacht affairs and the Irish language, Foras na Gaeilge and Údarás na Gaeltachta, whereas the Welsh Language Board, as we know at the time, having also been prescribed the promotional role concerning Welsh. The Irish language is accorded special status in Ireland and is protected by various pieces of legislation, and in particular Article 8 of our Constitution, which states that the Irish language is recognised as the national language of Ireland and its first official language. English is recognised as a second official language. The Constitution permits the public to conduct its business and every part of its business with the state solely through Irish. As a result of this constitutional right, public bodies have a duty to comply with this right. In practice, however, no effective provision was made in many contexts in the public sector to provide public services in Irish, as well as providing those services in English. Therefore, people who wished to conduct their business through Irish with the state often felt that they had no choice but to set aside the constitutional rights and language of choice and resort to the use of English, the second official language, to conduct that business. Until the Official Languages Act came into effect, people had no choice except to resort to the courts in order to obtain their constitutional rights. Irish is one of the oldest written languages in the world and was seen for the first time in own form in the 5th century. It was the dominant language in Ireland until the 16th century. Upon the establishment of Saor Stát Éireann, the Irish Free State of Ireland in 1922, the new government formally recognised Irish as the national and first official language of the country. As referenced earlier, this recognition was subsequently reinforced in the 1937 Constitution. In 1926, on Gaeltacht, the districts in Ireland where Irish was the language predominantly spoken by the community was recognised by the government as official Irish-speaking districts. The Gaeltacht area legislative orders of 1956 and 1967 resulted in the current Gaeltacht boundaries comprising parts of counties Cork, Donegal, Galway, Kerry, Mayo, Meath and County Waterford. An important legislative undertaking by government in its attempt to sustain the Irish language as a community language in the Gaeltacht was the enactment of the 2012 Gaeltacht Act. This act prescribed that the Gaeltacht would in future be based on linguistic criteria instead of on geographic areas. The Gaeltacht Act 2012 provides a statutory framework for undertaking the language planning process on a coordinated basis. Under the Act to date, there are 26 designated Gaeltacht language planning areas within the Gaeltacht, 8 Gaeltacht service towns outside the Gaeltacht, and 3 language networks. The 26 designated Gaeltacht planning areas are categorised according to the proportion of daily speakers of Irish in each area. For example, Category A reflects areas where more than 67% of the population speak Irish on a daily basis. The Gaeltacht service towns are situated in or adjacent to Gaeltacht language planning areas, and those towns already have a significant role in providing public services, recreation, social and commercial facilities for Gaeltacht areas. Irish language networks are areas which have already achieved a basic critical mass of community and state support for the Irish language. Each language planning area, service town and network must develop a language plan setting out initiatives to strengthen the Irish language as the community language in the area, and places a particular emphasis on language use in the family, community, education, social context, business and public affairs. Other notable developments by the state in its effort to sustain and promote the Irish language nationally in recent decades include the development of Gael Scoilina, or Irish medium immersion schools outside the Gaeltacht. Approximately 38,000 pupils were enrolled in Irish medium primary schools in the 2020 to 21 academic year, representing 7% of all enrolments outside of the Gaeltacht at primary level nationally. A national Irish language radio service, Radio na Gael, RT Radio na Gaeltacht, was established in 1972, and a national Irish language television, TG Car, was established in 1996. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which was reached among the political parties in Northern Ireland under the aegis of the British and Irish governments, sought to bring an end to the 30-year violent conflict in the region. As part of that agreement, provisions were made for the establishment of a North-South implementation body to facilitate the promotion of both the Irish language and the Ulster Scots language. As a result, Foras na Gaeilge, the body responsible for the promotion of the Irish language throughout the island of Ireland, was established. And I see we are joined here by Dr. John Walsh from Foras na Gaeilge today. The importance of language traditions in Northern Ireland was also recognised in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The British government committed to recognise the importance of respect, understanding and tolerance in relation to linguistic diversity, including the Irish language. This commitment is reflected in the proposed establishment of the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression in Northern Ireland, which includes provision for an Irish Language Commissioner and a Commissioner to enhance and develop the language, arts and literature associated with Ulster Scots, Ulster British tradition in Northern Ireland. Coming back to the Irish state context, comparing the 2016 and 2022 national censuses of population, the number of people who reported they could speak Irish increased by 6% from 1.76 million speakers in 2016 to 1.87 million speakers in 2022. As we know, censuses are reliant on self-reporting, so it's important to interpret these figures with a degree of caution. Of the 1.87 million people who stated that they could speak Irish in the 2022 census, 10%, or 195,000, stated that they spoke Irish very well. 32%, or 590,000, stated that they spoke it well. Both are significant cohorts. The 2022 census findings on the state of the Irish language and the Gaeltacht reveal that out of the total Gaeltacht population, these are the official Irish-speaking districts, out of a population of 106,000, 65,000 individuals aged 3 years and over reported being able to speak Irish. This reflects a slight decline from 67% in 2016 to 66% in 22. Among Gaeltacht residents who reported speaking Irish, 41% claimed to speak the language well, while 29% indicated proficiency and 28% struggled with the language, according to the census. These recent figures set out the challenges faced by government to increase the number of daily speakers of Irish to 200,000, as set out in the 20-year strategy for the Irish language. Since the enactment of the Official Languages Act 2003, over 20 years ago, significant gaps in state provision for the Irish language community have been identified. The ongoing trend and nature of complaints received annually by my office indicate that the state faces a crucial period in addressing the significant gaps in current public services provided to the Irish language community. Amongst the more pressing shortcomings are the shortage of staff with adequate proficiency in Irish to deliver core public services, such as high-quality Irish language telephone services and front desk service provisions. very basic services for any language community. Furthermore, there is a noticeable disparity between the provision of online interactive services to the public in English and the scant provision in Irish presently. Therefore, the new provisions contained in the Official Languages Amendment Act 2021 to strengthen the language rights of Irish speakers are very welcome. The implementation of some provisions in the amended 2021 Act have been firmly set in motion already. The noteworthy increase in Irish language advertising on all media is to be welcomed. There is now, for the first time, a statutory obligation on public bodies to have 20% of their annual advertising in the Irish language and to spend 5% of their annual advertising budget on Irish language media. This provision has undeniably had a positive impact already, contributing to increased visibility and a sense of vitality for the Irish language. The amended 2021 Act also includes a significant provision for the development for the first time of a national plan for Irish language public services through Irish. Essentially, this is expected to be a roadmap for how the public sector in Ireland will build capacity to ensure that the underlying objectives of the language legislation, that is to increase the standard and the number of public services available in Irish, are achieved. The recruitment provision that will require at least 20% of recruits to the public service by the year 2030 to possess competency in the Irish language will be key to significantly improving public services through Irish. The ethos of language rights and human rights originates from the aspiration to protect human dignity. If the language community wishes to use the language of their choice in their interaction with state services, the dignity of the community must be protected. I wish to draw your attention to another measure relating to the dignity in the amended language legislation in Ireland. It will be a citizen's right in Ireland for the first time to have his, her name, surname, title and address accurately recorded and used in Irish when conducting business with the public sector. To give effect to this fundamental dignity, public bodies must ensure that their ICT systems can implement this requirement. At this stage, it's important to recollect the raison d'etre of state public services, which is to enhance the quality of life in society and facilitate its development by addressing contemporary needs. Trust in public services is an emerging issue. It is imperative that language communities also have trust in the public services provided in their language of choice. Trust is nurtured when the language community receives equitable treatment when seeking public services. Values are pivotal elements of public service culture, as we know, and determine and guide public service standards. Therefore, values also have a key role in nurturing trust by the language community in public services. There are some important questions that need to be considered carefully. What role do national public service values play in ensuring language rights? Shouldn't public service values reflect the core values of language rights? Last year, 2023, the Irish Government published a very important strategy called Better Public Services, a transformation strategy to deliver for the public and build trust. Its vision is to deliver inclusive, high-quality and integrated public service provision that meets the needs and improves the lives of the people of Ireland. Over the course of the strategy, there will be a focus on measuring the high levels the high-level outcomes related to a 7-year public service transformation framework from 2023 to 2030. The strategy is aimed at ensuring the public sector in Ireland is better equipped to respond to current and future challenges. It is aimed in particular at delivering for the public and building trust in public services. To this end, this strategy espouses 5 key value drivers of trust: integrity, fairness, openness, responsiveness, and reliability. The strategy states that the 5 key value drivers concerned have been identified by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and provide a practical framework for the public service to take proactive and collaborative steps to enhance trust in public institutions. Learn from international best practice, measure trust levels over time, and how public services in Ireland compare internationally. For Irish language rights to be realised, particularly the new language rights enshrined in the Official Languages Act amended in 2021, it is imperative that the aforementioned values of integrity, fairness, openness, responsiveness and reliability are embedded in the foundation of all Irish language services going forward, and particularly in the new National Plan for Public Services in the Irish language. The value drivers of trust committed to in the strategy must be fully aligned to the public service needs of Irish speakers. Regrettably, our office's experience in investigating complaints in recent years has, in some cases, shown that the standard of services delivered to Irish speakers fall far short of the values committed to in the Better Public Services strategy. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it became evident that public services offered in the Irish language were often marginalised, which highlighted the shortfall surrounding the responsiveness of public sector in meeting language rights. Complaints made to the office during the COVID-19 pandemic increased by 18%. This is an insight into the public's difficulties accessing healthcare information and accessing online interactive services, for example, to register for a vaccine for the digital COVID-19 certificate. Non-compliance was also confirmed with respect to COVID-19 signage, school circulars, and websites, many of which were distributed or published in English only. The potential recurrence of solely English language public services in the aforementioned context in the event of an emergency due to insufficient planning and urgency in providing services in Irish is a significant concern. This underscores the vital importance of responsiveness as a fundamental value in delivering public services in Irish, as advocated by the government in its Better Public Services strategy. In another of its recent flagship strategies, Connecting Government 2030, a digital and ICT strategy for Ireland's public service, the government sets out a step change in how government services will be presented and used in the future. The government states that a step change in the pace of delivery of public services is required to reflect the pervasiveness of digital in every aspect of society and the corresponding expectations of stakeholders, including the public. Interestingly, the value of trust is also emphasised in this strategy through the government's commitment to create a trusted, human-driven, intuitive and inclusive world-leading digital service. The principle of inclusivity in the government's commitments and the value of fairness in the Better Public Services strategy has been significantly challenged by recent findings from our office with respect to Irish language rights. For example, as reported in my annual report for 2023, our investigations into numerous complaints reveal a noticeable disparity between the provision of online interactive services in English compared to the inadequate provision available in Irish. The current disparity between online digital services in Irish and English demonstrate the urgent need for the new language standards system prescribed in the amended 2021 Act to address this serious dearth of interactive online services through Irish. A key goal set out in the Connecting Government Digital Strategy for the Public Service is that 90% of applicable services will be provided online by 2030. The new Irish language standard system will therefore have a key role in ensuring that Irish language rights are embedded in the government's overall strategy for digital services in the coming years. In my recently published annual report for 2023, it was also highlighted that the lack of reliable language, telephone, front desk and help desk services is undermining the confidence of the Irish-speaking community in public services. The current deficiencies stem from a general lack of obligation on public services, on public bodies to provide these services, as well as sufficient staff with proficiency in the Irish language to deliver them. When individuals must wait 30 minutes for a response or receive a call back to an Irish language query, when a similar query in English is often addressed in just a few minutes, trust and confidence in public services by the Irish-speaking community is significantly diminished. It is important to ensure that access to high-quality public services in Irish is not unduly burdensome or restricted. I believe that two significant pieces of national legislation relating to language planning and language rights can work hand in hand to address this. Those being Ach na Gaeltachta 2012, as discussed earlier, provides a statutory framework for language planning in the Gaeltacht and is overseen by the Government Department for the Gaeltacht, and the Official Languages Amendment Act, whose implementation is monitored by my office. The utilisation of the national language planning infrastructure in Ach na Gaeltachta 2012 should be leveraged to establish service delivery hubs and service campuses in Gaeltacht language planning areas, in Gaeltacht service towns, and in language networks and urban Irish language centres. This approach would help to ensure that access to high-quality public services in Irish is more widely available. Additionally, these hubs and campuses would play a vital role in cultivating a critical mass of Irish language public services and fostering a vibrant community of public service staff and users. The new language standards, once commenced in Ireland by the Minister, will be crucial in ensuring fair treatment for Irish language speakers when seeking public services in Irish. These standards will specify the level of language proficiency required for public service staff to provide specific services in Irish, for example, telephone services, front desk services, and online communication services. Undoubtedly, there are significant opportunities to learn from our Welsh and Canadian colleagues with regard to language standards and how they greatly surpass the provisions contained in the current language schemes still in effect in Ireland. In summing up here, it is important to bear in mind the fundamental objective of state-provided public services, That is to enhance the quality of life of all citizens, to support societal development, and to deliver on language rights. As language commissioners and throughout the IALC community, we have a leading role in reinforcing the importance of core values in upholding language rights. As language commissioners, we have a statutory obligation and a leading role through our compliance and monitoring functions to impress on all stakeholders in government and the public sector that these values must be embedded in public services for our language communities. If we achieve this, the experience of our language communities in using public services in their language of choice will be all the more positive, which in turn contributes to the vitality of our valued languages. Guramagi.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Seamus. Bydd Seamus yn ddirprwy gadeirydd newydd i'r Gymdeithas yn dilyn yn cyfarfod cyffredinol. Thank you for agreeing to be a Vice Chair from tomorrow onwards, and shall look forward very much to working with you. Dwi nawr am wahodd Dr Fernande Ferran i'r llwyfan, a falle gawn ni gyfle i ofyn cwestiynau i'r ddau yn nhw'n dilyn y cyflwyniad yna. Cyn rapporteur arbennig y Cenhedloedd Unedig ar hawliau lleiafrifol yw Fernand, wnaethon ni fwynhau yn fawr iawn cyfarchiad byr ganddo fe neithiwr yn y lansiad, a mae'r sgwrs prynhawn yma gobeithio yn gyfle i ni edrych neu ddysgu ganddo fe beth ddysgodd e yn y cyfnod fel rapporteur am 6 mlynedd. Mae'n adnabyddus fel un o'r arbenigwyr mwyaf blaenllaw yn y byd ar hawliau dynol rhyngwladol ieithoedd lleiafrifol ac ar atal gwrthdaro ethnig, testun sydd yn hynod y bwysig yn y byd ar hyn o bryd. Fi'n credu bod ni'n cael hwyl gyda problemau technegol ar yr ochr chwith, ond fi'n siŵr byddwn nhw wedi datrys yn fuan iawn. Mae modd i chi ddarllen cefndir Fernand dan siaradwyr eraill ni gyd ar yn gwefan ni, gallwch chi ddysgu mwy amdanyn nhw a'i gwaith nhw. Ni'n dal i gael trafferthion. Hefyd, gwybodaeth, ni wedi ffilmio'r gynhadledd heddi, felly yn dilyn y gynhadledd, bydd modd i chi weld yr holl gyflwyniadau a hynny ar-lein, a dwi'n credu y byddan nhw cyn bo hir wedi hi steitlo hefyd fel y gallwch chi rannu'r cyflwyniadau gyda chi dweithwyr. Fi'n siŵr fyddwn ni yn barod mewn munud neu ddwy. Felly, gwych, ni'n barod. Felly, croeso cynnes iawn i Dr Fernande Ferran.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. Apparently, I'm shorter than Seamus, the Irish Commissioner. Here we go. Distinguished Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen, bonjour tout le monde. The conference's central theme is about increasing the use of official and minority languages. And I'd like to point out why this is quite a challenge, actually. I think all of us in the face of sometimes active misunderstanding, even ignorance, if not outright hostility, have the experience of colleagues, family members, the media, in fact, expressing hesitancy, if not rejection, of the idea of linguistic diversity. And I think we're all familiar with the story of Babel, where diversity of language is presented as divine punishment for human pride and disobedience. Many of you in Wales will have experience, in fact, of mainstream British media too often describing Welsh as, well, you've heard it, pointless or a waste of money. In some countries, you may even face the perception that language diversity is a threat to national unity. By the way, we hear that a lot in France and a few other European countries, as you know. And that, in some cases, means significant number of people believe that one state should only have one people united by one language, sometimes to the exclusion of all others. And this brand of nationalism is, in fact, in the increase in some countries around the world. And in the more extreme cases, results in situations such as we've experienced and we talked about at the United Nations in the People's Republic of China, where currently about 1 million Tibetan children and perhaps around 800,000 Uyghur children are separated from their families for most of their childhood and sent to residential schools that teach almost exclusively in the Putonghua, or Mandarin language. And I mention this example because specifically this is a practice that was similar to what was done to indigenous children in the last century in countries such as Canada, amongst others. A brutal policy of linguistic and cultural assimilation, as many of you will know, which has been called or described as cultural genocide. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is actually occurring right now in a country such as China, against some of its minorities in clear, massive violations of their human rights. There is, however, another take on the story of Babel, another possible narrative for human beings to truly reach their potential. Because if you think of the story of Babel, it's not only about punishment. It's actually sending humans on the path where they actually will be fruitful and actually move away from a monolithic society where only speaking one language and being one people does not necessarily lead to the greatest good for all. On the contrary, linguistic diversity is perhaps what is needed for richer, more stimulating, and lively societies. Just as bilingualism and multilingualism at the individual level has been shown in medical and other studies to suggest that we are predisposed to speak more than one language, and that doing so actually is healthy. It brings health benefits such as even delaying the onset of dementia. I'm very happy about that because my memory sometimes has not been very good. But let's contextualize the significance of a human rights approach to linguistic diversity, and consider why some communities seem to be able to better protect, at least to some degree, this language diversity, and how this relates to protecting individuals, yes, but also communities. And finally, let's reflect on your possible roles as language commissioners, and what you can and should be doing, and the many, many, many challenges that you will be facing. In a sense, what you are doing has behind it a lot of history. Even thousands of years ago, if we are to believe what Christians know as the Book of Esther in the Old Testament, or Megillat Esther in Hebrew. This, on the slide, which I think you're seeing now, is the first recorded account, more than 2,500 years ago, of public authorities reflecting the linguistic makeup of their populations and the reality of the languages spoken on their territory, where Esther was able to lobby and convince the king to adopt a multilingual approach, actually. In other words, this is one of the earliest acknowledgments, at least to a certain degree, that the language of the largest communities must be used by public authorities. If you want to adopt a patron of language commissioners, by the way, and one which empowers women, I propose Esther. You have here a tool of communication. To be effective, one has to reach the people, the population, in their own language. Now, there really are different ways of looking at this. There are, of course, different views or positions on the desirability even of doing so. Aren't we trying to preserve and promote diversity itself? Or in this case, is it part of a political or practical approach to respond to the reality of different languages and communities on a government's territory. And it is because there are these two different perspectives, one of promoting and respecting diversity, the other more practical as to looking how to respond for communication and other purposes to significant numbers of speakers, and how to reach them more effectively. Now, I mention this also because this explains, for example, for those of you in Europe, this explains why the Council of Europe has not one, but two legally binding treaties that deal with linguistic minorities or minority languages. You have, on the one hand, the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities, which actually has quite a large number of linguistic or language-oriented provisions. And on the other hand, you have the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. Now, the first one is clearly a human rights document, mainly recognizing individual human rights in relation also to language. And if you will, this reflects a demographic approach, looking at when you have significant numbers of speakers of national minority languages and how to deal with their language needs and how states have to respond to the use of minority languages in areas such as education, but also public services in general. The other one, the European Charter, is clearly oriented towards linguistic diversity as something that has to be protected throughout Europe. And in fact, quite clearly, it states that this document, that treaty, even though a legal document, does not create any rights that can be enforced. And I should emphasize that despite these two documents being legal documents, treaties, both of them are limited from a legal point of view, which for reasons that I can explain later if there is an interest in that. In many parts of the world, history and social context have at times resulted in opposition to the idea that linguistic minorities are entitled to any right to use their language. But at least I have to say and emphasize that at the United Nations there is a growing and clearer connection made between language and human rights. On the one hand, UNESCO tends to celebrate linguistic diversity in its pronouncements and activities, whereas at the United Nations we have put forward a much more human rights approach, and where we emphasize that where you have significant number of speakers of a minority language, they are entitled, in application of the prohibition of discrimination, but also in some cases freedom of expression, to have authorities, public authorities, the state, use their language. Now, those of you who were at the launch of this conference yesterday will remember how here in Wales, the first legislation limiting the use of Welsh was adopted almost 500 years ago. Now, at the time I said that's a kind of European record, but just to make sure I don't get in trouble in Ireland, it's not the first one, in fact, in Europe. In Ireland, in fact, almost 700, before I do that, apologies. Here you actually have an extract from the English legislation of 1535 and 1537, which actually restricted the use of the Welsh language. It is interesting to see what the perception was. Why did the government or the king at that time try to start suppressing the language of the Welsh? Well, here the legislation, an Act for the English Order, Habit, and Language, described Welsh speakers, and please do not be offended, Welsh speakers as rude and ignorant, of diversity being dangerous, and the use of the Welsh language as not natural in the country, and even seditious. It is, ironically, it's a rather still frequent theme that can be found in the history of many of the countries that are today represented by language commissioners. Going even further back in time, as I said, because in Ireland, they have this kind of experience going back even further, the Statutes of Kilkenny of 1367, where it is indicated that any Englishman or Irish living amongst them will be threatened with the loss of property and positions unless they abandon any use of Irish or having an Irish name. And if we cross the pond to the colonies, this attitude towards minority languages, such as, in this case, the French in North America, has a long, illustrious tradition, well expressed in what is known as the Lord Durham Report, where French Canadians are described as, or those at least, who have retained their languages, are described as destitute because of this, with no history and no literature, and who could only be elevated out of their inferiority when they are made to speak and become English, as should everyone in North America. None of these approaches completely succeeded, but they did have an impact, didn't they? Many of you will know that this was a period of exclusion, and today we would say discrimination towards these linguistic communities, where speakers of Irish, Welsh, French, and other languages, which would eventually become minorities in their own countries. And by the way, this clearly also occurred for indigenous peoples in most parts of the world. All of these examples were not part of a natural process. This did not happen by accident. The assimilation, the discrimination, the exclusion, the, in a way, pressure that led to the weakening of these languages were the result of legislation, prohibitions, bans, and even physical punishment for those who did not speak the dominant language. Many of you here in Wales, in Ireland, in Canada also, we know of long-standing traditions where children were physically beaten in schools if they dared to speak a minority language. And that actually continued until the 20th century in some parts of the world. Laws and policies, which today would be considered to be discriminatory, to limit freedom of expression in some cases and other human rights violations in international law, resulted in what was intended: assimilation of significant portions of the population, as well as often laws and policies which resulted in the influx of speakers of the dominant language in the traditional regions inhabited, for example, by these linguistic communities, including indigenous peoples. Now, human rights today are mainly individual rights, but they still can have a significant impact for the maintenance of linguistic diversity and for communities themselves, but especially to protect the language of these individuals and communities. In education, there's a famous French saying, une langue qu'on n'enseigne pas est une langue qu'on tue. You kill a language if you don't teach it. You destroy a language if you do not teach it. But there's a human rights dimension to this. In education, for example, which is a human right in international law, the prohibition of discrimination, including in relation to language, means that there is an obligation to use minority languages as medium of instruction in public schools where it is reasonable and justified, in a way that is proportionate and to the degree and extent that reflects the numbers of individuals affected, their geographic location, the previous use of the language in education, and so on. There's quite a large series of factors involved. There is still some debate, I think we need to be honest about this, there is still some debate and dissent at the international level that, on this issue, but the basis is already in place at the United Nations. Though, once again, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, and one which is not always fully appreciated or understood. And I have to warn you, the situation is slightly different in Europe. In Europe, the standards that are applicable in terms of international human rights are those represented by the European Convention on Human Rights. And there is divergence, quite frankly, between the international human rights system and the European human rights system, especially in relation to the rights of minorities, linguistic, and even religious minorities. The jurisprudence, the cases, the case law coming from United Nations committees and the European Court of Human Rights quite often don't agree anymore in many areas, and particularly in relation to education and minority languages. I just want to warn you that very recently, the European Court of Human Rights has come out with 2 judgments involving the use of the Russian minority language in Latvia, which essentially says that, no, there is no right to be educated in the minority language, at least in the case of Latvia. For many reasons, that decision, I must warn you, is different from what we hold as the position of the right to education without discrimination in international law. Here in Europe, for a number of reasons, the concept of human rights and of language rights is not embraced fully by the European Court of Human Rights, and you should be aware of that. And I'm using diplomatic language right now. Ladies and gentlemen, in a world where linguistic diversity seems under threat, we live in a world where linguistic diversity seems under threat. There are some 7,000 languages currently spoken across the world, but it seems now perhaps 90%, 90%, of these could disappear in the next 100 years. It's not a rosy picture, and it is one that we actually have to understand, but also to look at what are the factors that are leading to this disappearance. But there's also a growing phenomenon I mentioned earlier, where some governments are actually prohibiting the use of teaching of some minority languages. But despite that, and by the way, I'm an optimist. It was one of the job requirements when I became Special Rapporteur at the United Nations. But despite that, there are some good practices that exist, even though in countries which officially are receptive to language rights, there are always, obviously, very serious challenges. But there are also lessons to be learned for what seems to work well on the ground, and even situations where the practices seem to have quite an impact, a positive impact. And it's quite telling to consider a few of these examples where some minority languages are not only doing well, but actually seem to be strengthening, and at the same time, in the same country, others are not. And I'll have to describe this perhaps more clearly with this graph, which you might not see very well, but I'll try to describe it to you. What you have here shows over more than a century, from the beginning of the 20th century, 1901, to most recently 2016, I think. What you have here shows a proportion of French-speaking people which has gone down dramatically outside of Quebec. We see a 2/3 fall, where French Canadians outside of Quebec, the proportion in terms of the population in Canada outside of it. And so that today, French-speaking people outside Quebec and Canada represent only 3%, falling from about 10% at the beginning of the 20th century. During the same period, over 100 years, the French-speaking population inside Quebec maintained itself rather well. Not perfectly, and we can also always discuss the detail of the statistics, the data, but there is something happening. There are practices that are different, in fact, inside and outside Quebec, that perhaps explain why the French-Canadian population outside of Quebec has dropped so dramatically. And I am originally from one of the regions outside Quebec, from a French-speaking community. And what is interesting, perhaps, here is the similarities you have in another part of the world, once again, across the pond. The similarities of this phenomenon, in a way, in Finland, between members of the Swedish minority outside of the Öland Islands, which has a very high degree of autonomy, even stronger than Francophones in Quebec, by the way, and the proportion of their cousins, the Swedish-speaking minority, on the mainland over about a century and a half, while the Swedish-speaking minority on the mainland has lost 2/3 of their proportion of the population, in fact, almost the same as the French-speaking population outside of Quebec. The Swedish minority in the Öland Islands has, on the contrary, maintained its numerical proportion. And they have, by the way, no difficulties in exercising their language rights, which is not true for the Swedish-speaking population on the mainland. And this is often the case in other countries where there are perhaps too often we forget. And here I would like to mention countries such as Switzerland and even Belgium, though often whenever I mention these two countries, I am told, don't do that. Switzerland and Belgium are unique. You can't really use them as examples of anything. They're really only developed in a kind of a very specific context. Well, actually, they do have commonalities with the factors which may lend themselves to a better understanding of and implementation of language rights that I showed to you in the case of Canada and Finland. But before I jump to certain conclusions, there's one last example which I think may provide further insights on the similarities, the patterns that we should perhaps retain. Here you have, in almost the same period, by the way, so I've used a period of almost 100 years or over to show you the trends, what is happening in different parts of the world. In almost the same period, the German-speaking minority in Italy, as well as the much smaller Ladin linguistic minority in the province of Bolzano, have maintained their proportion of the population, and even in the case of German, increased their proportion in recent decades. There's all kinds of reasons for that. Once again, that will be the subject of further discussion. Recent studies suggest that immigrants, in fact, in growing numbers, even prefer to send their children to German medium public schools, minority schools, in fact, in this part of Italy, in this autonomous region, partially because of the view that students in that school system will benefit from acquiring a working knowledge of both German, the minority language, and Italian, the majority language, which would improve, in the views of many of these immigrants apparently, would improve their employment and other opportunities. The Bolzano example has one rather unique characteristic that I think we need to be aware of and be sensitive to. And that is because the civil service employment and other opportunities are strictly regulated by a linguistic quota system. Not something that would be perhaps acceptable in many countries, but it is interesting in that it is a rather strict system based on the population percentages. Currently, I think it is about 70% of all civil service employment in the province of Bolzano are reserved or designated for members of the German-speaking minority. And about 25% of them are designated for members of the Italian-speaking community, and about 4 to 5% for members of the Ladin-speaking community. And this is quite a strict quota system. But on the other hand, what you have in Bolzano is the freedom of choice. Individuals can decide which linguistic community they identify with, and theoretically have access to employment that are reserved for these categories. Now, this system is not without criticism, of course, but at the end of the day, it does seem to work. It does seem to ensure the protection and strength of these two language minorities. And so in that context, it cannot perhaps be said to be unreasonable or unjustified. And as the data that you have on the slide shows, the German-speaking minority's position has in fact strengthened. And the Ladin, which is quite a small linguistic minority, has actually been stable for decades. And that is quite telling, because that actually is not the story of most linguistic minorities around the world, even perhaps in countries such as Ireland, Wales, and others. So what you have here, and in other cases, are usually in place, what you usually have in place are laws and policies that comply, I would suggest, that comply more effectively with the human rights of minorities. And they may not be perfect, but they do more or less share common approaches, which I will try to summarize. In a report that I prepared a few years ago in support of the adoption in South Africa of its first official languages legislation, I identified the importance of institutions such as commissioners and ombudspersons. Now, without going through the detail this afternoon again of what was covered in this rather extensive report, I would like to point out that language legislation needs to create real obligations and not to be merely symbolic, and not left to the whim of national or regional governments, which might not always be sensitive or receptive to the needs as well as the rights of minorities. Amongst these, and I want to emphasize this, there needs to be clarity in terms of legislation. And in particular, what are the objectives of any legislation on language, and whether they truly guarantee the use of a minority language, and whether they contain clear, binding, and enforceable obligations. And quite often, I think we need to be honest here, this is not the case in many situations of language legislation around the world. Quite often it's symbolic, it's aspirational, which is good, absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it seems, and in fact in many of the examples that I've shown, the best practice is actually to have enforceable, clear objectives, and objectives which clearly state that individuals belonging to certain linguistic communities have the right, must be guaranteed, education in their own language in certain conditions and so forth. And the other aspect it seems to be common in the examples that I raised earlier of Canada, Finland, and Italy, although this brings up a more controversial issue, but we're here to challenge and stimulate you, after all, before you have a nice dinner this evening, or go to see the Pink concert, whichever is best. What needs, I believe, reflection is to look into, which in a sense, this may go way beyond any possible mandate you have as language commissioners, but still, something perhaps to keep in mind. While enforceable laws and mechanisms for implementation of language rights are absolutely necessary, they're not, or they're seldom sufficient to truly ensure in the long term that the language of minorities will be protected and maintained if there is not the recognition that we are not only dealing with individuals, but we're also dealing with communities. And this is an aspect which sometimes international law or human rights law has somewhat of a difficulty with. The current understanding of human rights is of individual rights only. But when we talk about language, it's not only about individuals, it's also about a community. And in order to truly be able to protect the language, to ensure members of this community are free to effectively use and enforce their rights, quite often you also have to take into consideration how the community itself is involved in this process. From the examples that I showed earlier, it is where minority languages are seen as part of the natural landscape, where they are attractive and portrayed positively as a strength, an asset, a positive characteristic, not only for its speakers, but for others who may share the same territory. These seems to be some of the keys to present language, not just as an individual issue, but also as a community one that needs to be taken into account. And what I describe absolutely needs to include newer arrivals. It is where the members of a linguistic community can prioritize and invest in their art, their literature, their history, and exercise even control or even political power over their own affairs as much as possible, that you seem to have the best examples in practice of language communities not only surviving, but actually progressing, developing, growing stronger. So it is noteworthy that the collective dimensions are perhaps increasingly being recognized, at least in some countries. That goes too fast. At least in some countries such as Canada. Stop it. Though obviously it's again a particular, Mr. Bond, and in particular constitutional context, he's in a hurry. Or in Canada, you have linguistic communities that can be better. There's someone actually playing for my pointer here, that linguistic communities can be better equipped to protect their languages, including in the field of education. Now, you can see that in the recent decision of the Canadian Supreme Court that I have here. It is an indication or recognition of the importance of community, even in the context of education, and perhaps especially in the context of education, where you have communities that can achieve effective control over their affairs and over their own territory, where they are concentrated. And I'm getting there because I think this is a signal that my time is running out. In much, if not all of the examples that I showed earlier, your role as commissioners is crucial. Crucial in that minorities are amongst the world's most vulnerable, and they are those that are most in need of strong protections, remedies, and resources if we are to be truly serious in addressing the rights issues for some of these minorities and to protect their language in their own country. So to you commissioners and others, I would suggest be innovative, be daring, and push your mandates to the absolute limits of what can be done. Be innovative and be agents of change. Because for many, there may be no one or nothing else to defend their languages and their rights. So let me end on a more upbeat note and ask you to keep in mind, before many of us head out later, as I said, to either dinner or the Pink concert, how the world needs heroes right now. When minorities sometimes feel more and more vulnerable, when facing a rising tide of intolerance, and worse, from social media sometimes, and even politicians. Linguistic minorities, amongst others, need agents of change, such as yourselves. We need you to help those who are not always able to ensure their own protection and the respect of their human rights. We need agents of change, or perhaps I should say special agents for the defense of language rights. Now, okay, someone is here playing with the trigger. There's a job opening, by the way. I don't know if you've heard. It may be a situation where some of you are interested in Hollywood for a very special agent, one which for the first time is apparently open to men and women alike, by the way. So go forward, O agents for languages, to defend dignity, values of tolerance and inclusion, and language rights, equality, and diversity throughout the world, as has been expressed in many traditions going back even thousands of years or hundreds of years, that linguistic diversity is something to be celebrated and embraced rather than be feared and suppressed. Merci beaucoup. Diolch.
Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn. Ni wedi cael sgyrsiau mor ddiddorol y prynhawn yma yn dydyn ni. Comisiynydd Iwerddon yn codi pethau pwysig i ni'n gorfod i ystyried yng Nghymru o ran datblygiad technoleg ac yn y blaen, a wedi cael yn hysbrydoli gan y syniad a gallwn ni fod yn James Bond. Wel, gwych. Dyna ffordd i orffen sesiwn gyntaf'r prynhawn. Dwi am eich gwahodd chi nawr i gael paned arall. Mae nawr yn tua chwarter wedi 3, felly os allwn ni jyst cael paned falle a dod nôl fan hyn fel bod ni'n dechrau sesiwn y prynhawn am hanner awr wedi 3, fydde hwnna'n gret. Felly diolch yn fawr iawn a fydd cyfle i ofyn cwestiynau dros baned fi'n siŵr. Diolch.
Okay, I'll go this way. Thank you. I'll send it to my communication officer. She's always like, okay, I think it would be good. Yeah, I think it would be good. Just and I will. I was joking. I said I will tag our French forces.
Prynhawn da, eto, good afternoon. Gai wahodd chi I ddod nôl, mae'n flin dyn ni bod y toriad yma'n fyr. Bydd dim bris, gawch chi ddim kick out ar y diwedd. You won't be thrown out the end, there'll be more chance to mingle again at the end, I promise. Ond gai ofyn I chi gymryd eich seti eto. We ask you to take your seats again. If your translation equipment is turned off, please give it a little boost again. Diolch yn fawr.
Croeso cynnes nôl I chi a diolch I chi am gadw ar amser. Fy mraint I nawr yw gwahodd Raymond Thaberg I siarad â ni. Mae'n gomisiynydd ers 2018. And you haven't got the headsets in, so I'm talking all sorts of nonsense about you. But welcome this afternoon, and we very much look forward to your talk. Cyn hynny, wedi mwynhau gyrfa hir ac ymrywiol ac yn arbenigo mewn ieithyddiaeth a chymunedau ieithyddol lleiafrifol fel academydd ac uwch was sifil. Swyddfa Comisiynydd Ieithoedd Swyddogol Canada yw'r mwyaf a'r mwyaf profiadol yn y maes yma ac maen nhw'n gweithredu deddf ieithoedd swyddogol ers 1969, ond cafod diwygiadau sylweddol I ddeddfwriaeth yn ddiweddar, felly mae'n amserol iawn bod Raymond yn cyflwyno ni prynhawn yma. On a personal look, I'd like to thank Raymond for the support I've had since I've started in my post. We've enjoyed our team's meetings very much, and I shall look forward to hearing about your work and your wisdom this afternoon. Felly, drosodd I chi. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here. It's always daunting to be the last speaker at a conference. It reminds me of this billboard that I saw in the city of Winnipeg. Winnipeg is the center of Canada, not the power center, in the middle, actually in the middle of the country. And there was this church, and there was this billboard, and it says, do you have trouble sleeping? Come in and listen to one of our sermons. So I'm just not setting this up in terms of you'll fall asleep, but it's always a challenge to be the last speaker. So first, I'd like to thank Effa for her team at the Welsh Language Commissioner's Office for hosting our conference this year and for inviting me to speak today. This conference is a special one as we celebrate the association's 10th anniversary. My predecessor, Graham Fraser, was involved in the creation of the association, and I'm pleased to see how far we've come since 2014. We now have new members and new observer members. This worldwide interest in the associations seems to be a testament to the place and role the association plays in supporting and advancing language rights. I'm delighted to be here in Wales today to learn from your experience and to share with you the challenges and opportunities we face in Canada with the coming into force of our new federal language policy. I'd like to go back a few decades to give you a sense of how Canadian society has changed over the past half-century and the impact that it has had on our official languages, English and French. It has indeed been a long and winding road, to quote the Beatles song of similar vintage, but it's also been a worthwhile road to travel, as I believe we now have legislation that is properly equipped to secure a promising future for both of our official languages in Canada. So why did we need a modernized act? In my own lifetime, I witnessed firsthand some extraordinary changes in Canadian society. I grew up in Western Canada in the primarily English-speaking province of Manitoba, and while my village, Saint-Anne-des-Chênes, was nearly 100% French-Canadian, there was no French school for me to go to. But because my parents and other parents fought for our education rights, my younger siblings were able to be educated in French in Manitoba. These were my first experiences learning about rights and diversity. Times, they were changing. Bob Dylan. It's important to recognize just how divisive the issue of language was in Canada in the 1950s and 60s. It was a period of significant social, economic, and political change. And the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism was created to address the place of Quebec and French in the country. The Commission's consultations and findings led to an official declaration of English and French as the official languages of Canada, the adoption of the Official Languages Act, the position of Commissioner of Official Languages, and the introduction of policies on official languages and multiculturalism. I was 17, do the math, when the Official Languages Act was passed in 1969. For me and those of my generation, it was a declaration of recognition for my mother tongue across the country and an affirmation of who we were as French Canadians and as Franco-Manitobans. It was a recognition of our identity. I grew up among increasing diversity as Canada's multicultural policy took wing in 1971, and I saw our collective rights and freedoms entrenched in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, just as my own children were growing up. From my experience, I feel that I've lived Canada's transition from celebrating French and multiculturalism mostly as folklore to now recognizing official languages' rights and the rights underpinning multiculturalism as a matter of social justice as well. Today, it's becoming especially important to address inclusion and diversity issues to ensure that everyone is fully involved in and contributing to society. The way I see it, there are many facets to inclusion and diversity in Canadian society, and they're all part and parcel of the broader societal value of living together, le vivre ensemble, as we say in my native French. In 2019, the Indigenous Languages Act was passed to maintain, revitalize, and promote Indigenous languages in Canada. And Ron Ignace was appointed as the first Commissioner of Indigenous Languages. This was an important step along our path of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. As a country, it's important for us to recognize the work that needs to be done to support and promote Indigenous languages alongside recognizing two official languages and celebrating ethnocultural diversity. Indeed, many Canadians are impacted by more than one of these key nation-building issues. Belonging to different groups, embracing multiple identities, this is now a common reality for Canadians, including me. My own grandchildren are both Indigenous and Francophone. The narrative around official languages is changing to become more inclusive. We now recognize in our increasingly diverse society that identities are not formed along language lines alone. Canada is a country of immigrants, and the communities of today look dramatically different than the communities of yesteryear. Today, we talk far more about official language communities and what it takes to sustain and contribute to their vitality. We talk about ensuring that initiatives are being planned by and for communities to achieve their best effect. And we acknowledge the need to take extra care to protect the French language in our country in the face of the growing prevalence of the English language. More broadly, Canadian society has transformed at an accelerated rate in the past decade, and especially since the onset of COVID. But I think it's fair to say that internationally, we're all facing changes on multiple fronts: social, economic, environmental, and technological. Technology, for one, has had enormous impact on services delivered, or how they are delivered. Who here remembers the rotary phones of the 1970s? There's probably young people in this room who have never seen one. I saw the birth of the fax. I will probably see the death of the fax. So technology moves very, very quickly. That, together with paper correspondence, was our main tool for communicating with citizens at that time. Today, we wonder about the potential impacts and opportunities associated with artificial intelligence and service delivery and translation. Change has become the norm, and that requires us to continuously adapt both as individuals and as society. With this backdrop of constant change, official languages have made news headlines consistently in Canada in recent years, whether in relation to access to education, from early childhood to post-secondary levels, to healthcare, including public safety, as was so apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic, to our experiences in the workplace, or when we travel, or the impact of immigration, or the media on language use. I believe that our experience with language is so important to us because it is so intrinsically linked to our identity. And I've always thought that it is important that official languages are being talked about on the national stage because it means that we're thinking about the effect they have on society rather than ignoring them or taking them for granted. All of the changes we contend with have an impact on how our federal language policy supports our citizens. Canada's 1969 Official Languages Act was updated in 1988. Both versions address the specific social context and realities of their times, and certainly helped us achieve many things, including greater representation of our two language communities within the federal government, improved access to federal services in both official languages, advancements of French and English in Canadian society, and support and assistance for the development of official language minority communities. In the lead up to the 50th anniversary of our original Official Languages Act in 2019, there was significant reflection both within my office and among communities, various stakeholders, the media, and parliamentarians about the necessity to bring our federal language policy into the modern age and include more tools to address systemic issues and stalled progress in federal institutions. Over the course of a half-century, Canadian society had changed dramatically. The way we talked about language and identity had changed, and Canada's language policy needed to reflect that. And so, when I began my mandate in 2018, it was crystal clear to me that modernizing our Official Languages Act was essential, because Canadians deserve an act that truly defends their language rights and reflects the modern world they live in. So how did we go about achieving a modernized act? The past 66 years have been a truly transformational time for official languages in Canada. Within my office, from the start of my mandate, the project of modernizing the Official Languages Act became our North Star, and we aligned our internal and external actions around this fundamental priority. We started by holding national consultations in which official languages stakeholders raised questions and proposed solutions. This essential exercise helped me articulate my vision for modernizing the Act to the government. I called for an Act that would be relevant, dynamic, and strong. My focus was to ensure that the new Act reflected modern society and could adapt in step with change, and to ensure that the new Act would have teeth, du mordant, so that it would be enforceable. The experience of my office in its 55 years of existence confirmed to me and previous commissioners that our mainstay tool of moral suasion simply wasn't enough. In my second year in office, I released a position paper with an extensive series of recommendations to the federal government that could serve as a guide for modernizing the Official Languages Act. In stride with the government's reflections on the modernization of the Act, I issued statements and held meetings with stakeholders in the media, and I appeared before our two parliamentary committees several times to offer expertise and help guide the process. Because the new provisions in the Act that affect my powers had received broad consensus throughout the legislative process, we didn't have to wait for the new Act to come into force to embark on our own exercise to modernize the office of the Commissioner. In the fall of 2022, we started reviewing our processes and corporate structure. We set out to reimagine what our office should ideally look like. As part of our renewal exercise, we created internal working groups to look at best practices and how other similarly structured organizations effectively carried out their duties. The exercise gave us the opportunity to take stock of our organizational health and to reinvent ourselves so that we can be stronger and better equipped to meet future challenges and continue to be a leader in Canadian language policy. On the compliance front, my team began working on our complaint intake and investigation process. We were also able to take a closer look at our backlog of investigations and follow-ups. We implemented strategies to consolidate the complaints we received about the same institution into a single investigation and support federal institutions to help them address their challenges. For follow-ups to recommendations made in investigation, we grouped together cases involving similar issues in order to ensure a more systemic approach for institutions that generate multiple complaints. This has enabled us to follow more effectively on a significant volume of complaints. In terms of official languages promotion, we started looking at how to do better and better define our activities in relation to our mandate and in relation to the roles of other institutions responsible for promoting official languages in Canada, both in the federal public service and in Canadian society. As we reviewed other aspects of our organization, such as how we respond to requests for information, in addition, we revamped our website, which now features a new visual identity and a simpler, easier to navigate interface. Nearly a year ago, on June 20th, 2023, Canada's Official Languages Act was updated and received royal assent. So what has been the result? In my view, our new federal language policy is indeed relevant, dynamic, and strong. We've made a significant step forward in protecting the language rights of Canadians and enhancing the vitality of our official language minority communities. The Modernized Act now includes clearer provisions and better defined obligations to help federal institutions meet their official languages duties. And it provides important new means of tackling systemic problems while maintaining the achievements communities have made. As Commissioner, I also now have several new powers to help federal institutions improve their compliance with the Act. These include compliance agreements, which will legally bind a federal institution to comply, as opposed to the Commissioner issuing recommendations in an investigation report. We will issue orders, which are unilaterally made by the Commissioner and require a federal institution to take action to correct a contravention of the Act. Mediation, which can help to find a mutually acceptable solution to resolve a complaint for faster results. Administrative monetary penalties, which are aimed at promoting compliance rather than punishing contravention, and are up to an amount of $25,000. And new reasons for refusing or ceasing to investigate a complaint. For example, if we've already issued an investigation report on the same subject, or if the institution has already taken steps to correct the problem. Although we now have a new federal language policy in Canada, many pieces, including regulations, policies, and plans, still need to be developed to guide federal institutions in fully implementing that policy. The changes to our Act also necessitate a cultural shift within my organization. While I still have a dual protection and promotion role, my new powers will shift our functions more towards compliance. It may well be that I'll be called the language watchdog even more in the days to come. I'd now like to focus on one new part of the federal language policy that relates specifically to our conference theme. Live your language, increasing the use of minority official languages. In our most, and I'm speaking somewhat to what Monsieur de Varenne said a while ago. In our most recent national census in 2021, we learned that Canada has now 10.7 million French speakers, which is nearly 30% of our total population. That includes 7.9 million French speakers in Quebec, the only province where French is the sole official language, and 2.8 million more spread across the rest of Canada. French remains by far the most common language in Canada after English. It's by far the most common in Quebec, and by far the second most common in the rest of the country, where demand for French as a second language education remains high. 12% of English-speaking students are in French immersion schools across the country. But while there are more French speakers than ever before in Canada, the demographic weight of Francophones has declined. And although French continues to be resilient in Canada, Its current relative decline is increasing its vulnerability and therefore weakening Canada's linguistic diversity, especially outside Quebec, where the influence of English is omnipresent. Back home, we all know someone who has lost their French, whether they had it as a mother tongue or learned it as a second language, but are no longer comfortable speaking it. Francophones are understandably concerned, as am I. Our new Official Languages Act recognizes this relative demographic decline of Francophones. The Act now includes the requirement to adopt a Francophone immigration policy as a means to reverse the trend. My office played a key role in bringing attention to the decades-long deficit of Francophone immigrants to French linguistic minority communities across Canada. The government has now taken action in the Modernized Act to help rectify the problem. As the federal government refined its modernized vision of official languages, we saw an increased emphasis on the protection of French in Canadian society, which is now part of our act. This is very much about ensuring that people can indeed live in French, learn the language, and use it in various aspects of daily life across Canada. Recognizing the issue is the first step in making progress, and we now have that recognition built into our new act. At the same time, the new provisions in the act for protecting French have raised concerns among English-speaking Quebecers about preserving their language rights. These English speakers, many of whose families have lived in Quebec for generations, are the official language minority community in that province. Many of them can and do speak French, and they are on the whole allies in the efforts to preserve French in Quebec. But they're also understandably concerned about maintaining access to services in their own language and about being able to feel welcome and included in their home province. Similar to what I'm sure you've experienced in your respective countries, having two official language groups in Canada causes tensions that flare and fade. The dynamics are always changing because they're a reflection of our society. It is expressly because of these tensions and changing social dynamics that we need to continue to listen to our communities and closely monitor the implementation of our language policy using specific indicators so we can clearly identify any issues that may affect their vitality. Given that, we have a new obligation to review the Official Languages Act every 10 years. I'm confident that we're better equipped to adjust our policy as needed to keep pace with the evolution of Canadian society. And so, as there's a new chapter in the making in the story of language policy in Canada, suffice it to say, the modernization project has kept my office very busy, but it was well worth the effort. The entire process to revamp our act was truly years in the making and involved a sustained effort of my office, community members, stakeholders, parliamentarians, who all worked tirelessly to make the Modernized Act a reality. Although my new powers are definitely not a magic wand, my role as defender of the language rights of both Canada's official language groups has been strengthened significantly with the new Act. I mentioned earlier the importance of ensuring that we keep talking about language issues and their impact on our citizens. I believe that it's now as important as ever as part of our role as commissioners to help ensure that language issues remain at the forefront of public consciousness in our respective nations. In my experience these past 6 years as commissioner, consistent public recognition of the importance of official languages in Canadian society has helped us immensely in achieving our goal of revitalizing our language policy. I know that we also share the fact that our work will never, ever be completed, precisely because of the intrinsic link between language, identity, and our ever-changing societies. This is at once a daunting endeavor and an extraordinary opportunity. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech. Thank you.
Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn i bawb sydd wedi cyfrannu heddiw. Are you happy to take a question?
Sure.
Gyda ni amser falle mi neu ddau o gwestiynau, os bydd unrhyw un yn hoffi gofyn cwestiwn. Pawb wedi blino, eisiau mynd adre. Na? Free to go.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.
It's always good when the school mistress says you can now leave. So.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Wel, diolch yn fawr iawn i bawb sydd wedi cyfrannu heddi. Dwi wedi mwynhau'r sgyrsiau yn fawr iawn ac gobeithio eich bod chi wedi wneud heddi. Dwi'n sicr wedi dysgu pethau heddi a dwi'n siŵr y byddwn ni'n dysgu mwy dros heno a fori yng Nghymru yn Gwesteion sydd wedi teithio mor bell rhai ohonyn nhw i fod gyda ni yma heddi. Felly ni'n gwerthfawrogi yn fawr iawn y ffaith bod chi wedi dod i'n plith ni a gobeithio bod chi wedi teimlo'n croeso ni yma hefyd. Dwi hefyd eisiau diolch yn fawr iawn i fy swyddogion fy swyddfa i sydd wedi hwyluso gymaint gyda'r trefniadau. Mae nifer ohonyn nhw yn yr ystafell yma, y prynhawn yma, ond dwi eisiau diolch yn arbennig iawn i Eleri, i Manon, i Deian, i Hawys, i Nia ac i Emma, ond i bawb arall. Ond dwi'n gwybod bod chi wedi gwneud gwaith y tu hwnt i'r hyn y gallwn ni fod wedi gobeithio amdano fe'n trefnu popeth mor hwylus. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi. Ond diolch hefyd i'r holl swyddogion eraill sy'n fy nghynorthwyo i bob amser wrth fy ngwaith i. Un nodwedd ar y gymdeithas, fel ni wedi sôn, yw fel deddfwriaeth iaith. Mae'n parhau i esblygu drwy'r amser ac mae gyda ni aelodau newydd fel ni wedi sôn. Ond un nodwedd arbennig arall yw bod y gaderyddiaeth a'r ysgrifenyddiaeth yn symud o wlad i wlad. Fesul 2 flynedd, mae hynny'n beth iach iawn yn fy marn i. Mae'n sicrhau bod yna nodweddion arbennig yn perthyn i'r gwaith wrth i'r baton gael ei drosglwyddo o un wlad i'r llall. Dwi wedi cyfeirio yn barod a diolch yn barod i Seamus am fod yn isgadeirydd o fori ymlaen, ond dwi am wahodd i'r blaen nawr i orffen y gynhadledd Shirley MacLean, sef Comisiynydd Ieithoedd Swyddogol New Brunswick, sydd wedi cytuno i fod yn gadeirydd y gymdeithas am y 2 flynedd nesaf. New Brunswick oedd y dalaeth gyntaf yng Nghanada i roi hawliau dinasyddion dderbyn gwasanaethau gan y Llywodraeth yn ei dewis iaith. Felly dwi'n mynd i wahodd Shirley i'r llwyfan. I ddymuno'n dda iddi hi ar ddechrau ei chadeiryddiaeth a gan wybod y byddwn ni gyd yn edrych ymlaen i i'w chefnogi hi yn y gwaith ac gewn ni drafod dros swper falle hyn o lle fydd yn cynhadledd nesaf, neu ac i ni gyd yn edrych ymlaen at hynny. Felly, diolch yn fawr iawn, Shirley. Ac, Shirley, would you like to say? Yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Effa. Just in couple de mots, I'd just like to say a couple of words. I'd like to primarily thank Effa. And you have to notice that she indicated yesterday, I believe, that she took over the presidency or the chairmanship of this group when she started her position as commissioner. So that was not an easy task. I'd like to congratulate her for that. And I'd like to thank her for all her work over the year. Her in a new position, I think she did an excellent job, and we very much appreciated her work. I'm from New Brunswick. We live in a province where French is actually, statistically, we have the largest community of Francophones outside of Quebec. So statistically, we have a large number of Francophones. We do punch above our weight. We're a very small province. We're not like Ontario, larger province. Ontario actually has more Francophones than we have as population in New Brunswick. So we're small. We punch above our weight. We're the only province who is French is actually mentioned in our constitution under the charter. We have specific provisions in our constitution for the French language. So we have some very important powers, and I'm very lucky to be the commissioner of the wonderful province. So I look forward to meeting all of you over the coming year, and look forward to your support and your assistance as we go on from here. Thank you very much.
A dyna ddiwedd y gynhadledd. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. Siwrne saff adre.